Welcome to the cool skirt tutorial. Seam allowance is already included in the pattern and is 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters everywhere. I'm sewing a size 8 in a lightweight denim fabric and using a contrasting white thread for the top stitching. Make sure you use a matching thread for all construction seams. I'm using a dark gray thread which provides a subtle contrast for the purpose of this tutorial. Start by applying the fusible interfacing to the wrong sides of your facing pieces. The fusible interfacing should match the weight of your fabric. I always use a press cloth to keep the iron from getting sticky. Next, stay stitch the front and back skirt waist. To do this, stitch 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter from the skirt waist edge. This is an 1/8 shy of the seam allowance and will help keep the waist from stretching out as you handle the fabric. Next, we are going to sew the horizontal darts on the back skirt pieces. I find it helpful to mark the dart on the wrong side of the fabric before folding right sides together and pinning in place. When sewing, stitch to the point of the dart and then stitch 5 stitches beyond as close to the edge of the fold as possible. Then I like to run the stitch off by continuing to sew off the edge of the fabric. Then when there's a long enough tail, I lift my needle and presser foot and reposition over the dart bulk, making sure the thread tail is slack. Then I sew a small back stitch in the dart bulk. Press the dart bulk towards the hem. Next, we're going to overlock or zigzag all of our pieces, and we're going to do it according to this guide. Let's start with the center back edge where we just sewed the darts. When you get to the right angle of the kick pleat, fold at the corner of the fabric so that it becomes straight, and it should turn out very clean. When starting up the stitch again, you can pull the overlock tail to the front so that you have a very clean start to the stitch. Place the 2 center front skirt pieces right sides together and sew from waist to drill hole, back stitching securely at the drill hole point. Fold back the skirt kick pleat extensions at each hem notch, along with the seam we just sewed. Place the kick pleat insert right sides together to the skirt kick pleat extension and pin along each long side. And make sure that you are only sewing the 2 layers, that is the kick pleat extension area of the center front skirt and the actual extension piece. Do not also sew through the front of the skirt. Sew on both sides of the center front extensions. The top and the bottom should remain unsewn. Next, place your skirt on the table and make sure everything is aligned nicely, and then with a contrasting thread, baste a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters from the top edge of the kick pleat through all layers. Make sure you start the basting stitch with a good couple of inches of length to your thread. I didn't, and it actually kind of came out later on in the process, so just make sure that you secure it in some way. I also did a stitch that was perpendicular at each end so that I know where the kick pleat ends. This will help us top stitch neatly later. Place the side front skirts to the center front skirt panel right sides together, matching at the double notch. Make sure you don't apply the side seam by accident. The curve of the side seam is much more pronounced than the front seams we are going to sew. Stitch this together. Then press the seams open. Place the two back skirts right side together and sew from the waist to drill hole, backstitching securely at the drill hole point. Fold back the skirt kick pleat extensions at each hem notch and press open along with the seam. Place the kick pleat insert right sides together to the skirt kick pleat extension and pin along each long side. Sew to both sides of the center front extensions. And just like the front, the top and bottom should remain unsewn. Place your skirt on the table and make sure everything is aligned nicely. And then with contrasting thread, baste that 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters from the top edge of the kick pleat through all layers. Just as we did on the front, and this is going to help us top stitch neatly later. Roll the zipper teeth away from the zipper tape and iron on a cool setting. This will help you get close to the teeth, allowing you to sew a truly invisible construction. I am right-handed, so I chose to place the zipper in the side that would be on my right. Place the zipper right sides together along the side seam of your choice, starting with the left-hand zipper tape. Usually you can align the top edge of the zipper tape with the top edge of your piece, but the most important thing is that the top nib of the zipper is out of the way of the stitch line. So it should be about 1/8 or 3 millimeters away from the seam allowance. Pin the zipper in place, and if you have a narrow 3/8 of an inch zipper tape like mine, you need to place the edge of the zipper tape 1/8 or 6 millimeters from the edge of your fabric, as you want to achieve that full 1/2 inch seam allowance. You're going to pin all the way down to the notch, and that's where you're going to backstitch. And you're going to use an invisible zipper foot. Once you have sewn this, zip up the zipper and mark on the opposite zipper tape exactly where the zipper aligns with the notch. Open the zipper again and line it up on the other side of the skirt, right sides together. Match the marking on the zipper to the notch. And then stitch in place. Close the zipper again and place the side seams together. Stitch from the zipper end to the hem using a regular zipper foot. Because my zipper foot is wide at the base, I find it difficult to start close enough to the zipper end because the zipper creates bulk and gets in the way of my slightly bulky zipper foot. So I position the seam with the zipper towards me and start about 2 inches away from the end and sew to the zipper end as close as I can, backstitching at the start and end. Then I turn it back around, and with my regular foot, I stitch from the end of that stitch to the hem. If you have a slimmer zipper foot, you may not have to do this 2-step process. Since my zipper was too long, I sewed a stationary zigzag with a width of 5 and a length of 0 where I wanted the zipper to end. Then I snipped off the excess and used a narrow stationary zigzag to tack the zipper to each seam allowance for a neat finish. And that would be a width of about 2 and a length of 0. Press this seam to finish, and when it comes to the zipper area, use more steam than pressure. This is how it will look from the outside. And this is the inside. At this point, change the thread to your top stitch thread. I used a thread with a slightly heavier weight than the usual Tex 27, or if you're using a Gutermann Sew All thread, that would be a Tex 30. My thread for top stitching is a Tex 40. The heavier weight allows it to pop out a bit more. On the front, stitch on the right hand side of the center front seam, 1/8 or 3 millimeters away from the seam. As you approach the kick pleat, stitch a hair past the basting at the top of the kick pleat. Stop, lift your presser foot and pivot to the right and stitch to the end of the kick pleat edge, using the basting stitch as a guide. Lift your foot again and pivot 180 degrees and sew over your stitch all the way to the left side of the kick pleat. Do a 180 again and stitch until you are 1/8 or 3 millimeters from the center front seam on the left side. Pivot and sew up the left side of the seam at 1/8 or 3 millimeters away until you reach the waist. For the side front seams, stitch an 1/8 or 6 millimeters from the seam on either side of the seam. On the back, stitch on the right hand side of the center back seam. Start 1/8 or 3 millimeters from the center back seam and sew down to just past the dart seam. Pivot toward the dart and sew close to the dart seam to the very end. And be very careful as you sew as slow as you can, because the dart bulk tapers off and can cause a crooked stitch if you're not careful. Once you reach the end of the dart, pivot 180 degrees and sew from 0 to 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters away from the first dart top stitch, stopping 1/8 or 3 millimeters away from the center back seam. Pivot towards the kick pleat and stitch a hair past the basting at the top of the kick pleat. Stop, lift your presser foot and pivot to the right and stitch to the end of the kick pleat edge using the basting stitch as a guide. Lift your foot again and pivot 180 degrees and sew over your stitch and to the left side of the kick pleat. Do a 180 once again and stitch until you are 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters away from the center back seam on the left side. Pivot in the direction of the waist and stitch towards the dart 1/8 or 3 millimeters from the center back seam. Stop in line with the lower stitch on the opposite dart top stitching and stitch to the dart end. Pivot towards the center back seam and stitch along the dart seam. Stop 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters from the center back seam and pivot towards the waist to finish the top stitch at the waist. And this is the beautiful result of the top stitching. Change your thread back to the matching construction thread. If you have a label, now is the time to apply it to the facing. I had every intention of adding my label and promptly forgot, so here's your reminder. Place front and back facings right sides together to the front and back waist. Stitch along the waistline only. Then turn it out and understitch the seam by folding the seam allowance towards the facing and stitching on the facing close to the seam. This keeps it from rolling out when you're wearing it. Next, trim the seam allowance. I finally got my hands on some duckbill scissors, which are great for grading seams. Then you're going to fold again right sides together at the seam, not the understitch, and pin along the zipper tape. Using a regular zipper foot, sew beside the zipper teeth to enclose. I used a bit of paper to correct and complete my backstitch at the start since it was pretty bulky here and had trouble getting it started, so you could just do that right off the bat rather than doing it later. Then turn this area out and press it. Lay one of the 4 hem facing pieces with right side facing up. Place 2 pieces right sides together, perpendicular to the first piece on each end, and pin together. Place the remaining piece right side together at the end of one of the pieces in the same way. Sew a stitch from the inner corner to the outer corner to create a continuous piece. Trim down the seam allowance and press open. Fold in one side by 1/2 inch and press. And if you have a really thick fabric, like a bull denim or something like that, I don't recommend folding it in because this is going to essentially be your hem stitch. Just overlock or zigzag to finish, and that will be much less bulky for you. Place the hem tape right sides together to the skirt hem and pin in place. Fold the kick pleat seam allowance towards the kick pleat to help reduce bulk. And then sew in place. Turn this out, and I recommend pressing before understitching this seam. Place the remaining open side seam of the skirt right sides together, matching notches, and sewing together with the facing and everything unfolded. Press the entire length of this seam open. And here I'm just quickly pressing that section of the hem. Then I am finishing the pressing of the seam on the facing area, and then I fold in the facing and press everything in place. Then you can go to the skirt hem and finish folding in everything and pressing in place. Going back to the facing, we're going to pin at the side seam, the center front, and the center back points so that you can tack these areas in place through the ditch of the seam. This way the stitch is fully concealed on the outside of the garment, but that facing is not going to flip out on you. And just so you know, a tack is just a tiny back stitch. Next, pin the hem in place along the entire length. Change back to your contrast top stitching thread. If your bobbin thread stitch looks good, you can get away with stitching from the inside as I am doing here. Otherwise, you could base the entire hem and use the base stitch as a guide to stitch evenly and to catch everything from the outside of the garment. Finish with a final press. You will have to snip the seam allowance above the hem facing for the kick pleat to lay flat. And no, laying that kick pleat seam allowance the opposite way does not correct this. So I just discovered that you have to snip this area to lay flat regardless of which way you had lain the seam allowance. To finish, add a little tack at the edge of the inner folds of each kick pleat so that everything just stays in place through wash and wear. And that's it. Your skirt is complete. I would love if you share your make with me on social media. You can tag me at Lydia Naomi Studio and use my hashtag #CoolSkirt so that I can see and share it. The following showcase of this skirt is a previous sample I made in a lovely black linen, and it's my favorite of the two, so I decided to model that one. Thanks so much for watching.